I'm Courtney. I'm a lecturer at Loughborough University, London. So if you're in East London, please come find me. Today, thankfully, all of the other people who just presented have very nicely teed me up for this. I'm going to talk about enculturation and value encoding, specifically in the design of vocal digital musical instruments, which is kind of my realm, but you'll see very much overlapping with the other things discussed today. So just as a brief definition, we've seen some examples here. Essentially, when we design technology, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. We design around our particular values, priorities, things that we've learned from our own cultures, whether that be sociocultural, human cultures, musical cultures. And essentially, as we move around the world, we start to adopt these norms, according to those values. Oops, there we go, sorry. So just a tiny bit about me and my biases, which go into all of my design. I come from a very classical background. I studied jazz and Western classical opera styles, and then now I've gotten into a lot more of a kind of very loose form, let's say noise-based music synthesis. So I work with a lot of biosignals. But I think it's important for us to kind of acknowledge these things when we talk about what we've designed. And the kind of values that go into it, because my background will be extremely different from all the other ones we've seen. If you are a guitarist, you're going to design an instrument completely differently than I would, because I have been singing in these contexts. So I think first steps. And what I want to talk about specifically are about some biases that exist within DMI design, or these assumptions that we can make, which is, number one example is the insistence on tactile control. We have to touch it. And then we also have the way that we value different pedagogies above others, particularly and very predominantly Western classical pedagogies. So I have a couple questions about, number one, how do we negotiate different value sets from converging cultures? And again, I mean cultures very broadly, musical cultures, human cultures. And then number two, how do we challenge these norms and bias in the way that we design technology? So just to kind of kick off a little bit, tangibility and graspability for expressive control. This old chestnut. We kind of have this sense that graspability and tangibility relies on some kind of really innate connection. We have to touch things, feel them, physically manipulate them, and this would provide a more immediate and responsive feedback. Oh, because I can touch it, it's got to be better than audio or visual representations. And I highly recommend you check out this paper. I think Xiao Zhao did a really amazing talk at CHIME recently, so please do look at this. But this is a huge bias that comes from engineering and from different HCI backgrounds, that we view tactility in this way. But what about the voice? I don't have to stand up here and touch anything for you to hear me. So what's going on here? Is this really always the case? We do see a lot of DMIs tend to do things like singing with the hands. And this is not to knock any of these things, because I do love these people, but it's interesting for us to consider why we continue to do this. Amazing Pamela Z, amazing Imogen Heap. Obviously, these are tools that are incredible. It's a very strange kind of disconnection that we're singing and then controlling. I don't know if you played it with a Mimu glove. It's not really doing anything with your voice. They're super fun, though. We can also have things that are way, way, way removed, like Cantor digitalis, which is super cool. It's an entire performance vocabulary built around controlling vocal synthesis on tablets. Amazing. But what's going on here that we've come to rely on tactility? And is that always the best case? Well, probably not. I want to show an example. This was this year's Guthman winner. Max Adai had vocal chords, which hopefully we can hear. Hello. Oh, there we go. Come on. I think YouTube is kind of bugging, actually. Oh, there we go.
The first place prize goes to
So Max actually pulls on these strings as a way of, well, it did skip ahead over his lovely singing, I'm sorry. Please check this out as well. But he literally pulls on these strings as a way of controlling vocal synthesis and adding this tactility. On the other hand, I'll pull in a hopefully not recently seen video of Xiao Zhao playing T-Vox. Come on. This is a vocal theremin. She's not really touching anything, but we have a bit of gestural control. And if you've seen her CHIME talk recently, she talks a bit about this. So if I just compare these, sorry, there we go. If I compare these things, so Max, and again, interacting with these things very predominantly tactile way. I don't know why that keeps happening, I'm sorry. Okay, I have to click. So in this paper that Max and Nina wrote for CHIME this year, there's this idea and this hypothesis that adding a dimension of tactile control will let people feel more empowered to control these expressive qualities, that we can physically pull on the interface to get these different changes in vocal output. And comparatively, if we look at this recent work by Xiao Xiao, we have actually kind of the opposite feeling. The intangibility of the theremin forces someone to concentrate on all the other modalities. And she's really fascinating to watch because she doesn't really even like look at anything. She's so embodied in this, listening to the body and the creative imagination. So sorry about my little slides here. Some other examples of embodied tech. So this is Kelsey Cotton, who's singing with Corsetto, which is a really nice corset-based interaction. I have another version that I had done with my colleague Rachel Frere, who is the Mimu Glove creator. And then some other work I've done lately with Lou Barnell on this project, To Fly Out in the Heat of Day. So all of these projects have to do with other kinds of movement or very low-level muscular activations, either on the diaphragm or on the neck and shoulders, using different kinds of sensor mechanics. So we're not actually touching anything here. There's whole realms of information that are available to us that don't have to come via the hands. So we tend to see that we gravitate towards these touch-based interfaces, but there are other options possible. I can play a tiny bit of Lou, I hope. So she controls all of these vocal loops with her shoulder movement. As she stretches. So again, just focusing on different ways of interacting. We're not necessarily limited just to touch, but it tends to be the thing that we gravitate towards because somewhere down the line somebody told us that touch was really expressive. And it is, but it's not the only thing, right? Another thing to consider with vocal DMIs is how we encode ideals from vocal pedagogy. And here we can get into quite a lot of the things actually we just heard in the previous talk. We have a lot of colonial biases, this perceived superiority of Western classical music. For instance, that's what we notate. So everything we build that revolves around notation is constrained to a very particular set of values and paradigms. We also already have a lot of things like assumptions over people's norms, physical appearances, race and timbre associations that go into the way that we perceive sound, especially around the voice as a form of identity. And what do we do about this tension that forms between different forms of knowledge, so different pedagogies and social cultural expectations? I just want to briefly kind of touch on some points from Nina San-Eitzheim, if you're not familiar with her work. She's done quite a lot of work around this idea of racialization of voice and voice as a social practice. So Eitzheim talks about the fact that often, because the voice is an element of identity, that skills can be reduced to an expression of biographical circumstances. For instance, black singers might not be actually revered for their technical prowess and skill, but rather as a kind of facet of this homogeneous group of black voices. And vocalization, is a social practice. So we learn to hear qualities based on different sociocultural norms and biases. So stereotypical roles and views of black singers, for instance, in terms of race as opposed to vocal style and technique. And then this is projected by listeners onto singers. There's this feeling of an innate black voice that Eitzheim studies. And there's also quite a lot of association, again, of this superiority of a Eurocentric Western classical vocal practice as opposed to black singing, which originates very often in kind of segregated musical practices, spirituals, and instead of being renowned for superiority in terms of practice and technique, tend to be seen within these kind of homogeneous ways based on culture. Eitzheim also does quite a lot of work within the voice as a material, because of course that is the conduit through which we relate to the world, and the physical materiality of our body does impact how we're seen and heard. So this is Maria Callas, who is an opera singer who is kind of revered and hated at the same time. She was known for being a bit difficult, and she also had so much criticism of her weight as she was in the spotlight. And then what we end up having as CHIME studies is this idea of Callas, the voice, also portrayed these same kinds of qualities. Because Maria Callas was seen in these ways, her voice itself was also seen as very mesmerizing, but also totally out of control. People would comment on how it was ruined because of her dieting and her weight loss and gain. So we see that the voice is not just this thing that exists out in the wild. It's associated to people and to cultures, expectations of women, for instance. And yeah, I see some of these examples in the way that we encode data, adding adjectives to female voices, or you have a paper which is about the centuries of shrill and the way that we label particular individuals' voices. So these are things that can kind of come into the interplay between technology design if we consider what we're already thinking about when it comes to the voice. And just a little bit on a study that I had done, a lot more benign than this, but some ways that we see different pedagogical backgrounds come into play. So during my PhD, I designed this guy, just the Vox EMG board, and it essentially takes electromyography, so muscular activation signals, and we can do all kinds of things with this data, still have sound escapes and sonification. But this is designed under my bias, which I kind of mentioned at the beginning. So I came from a Western classical background, and for me and my conceptualization of sound, and having lived and designed with this for quite a long time, I was able to get a lot of different perspectives out of working with it about my own practice. But then when working with other people who came from American jazz traditions, who were Hindustani singers, for instance, they completely, it was like off the rails, had no idea how to fit that into their practice. And if we think about that, that makes sense. This device and the way that I had programmed the mappings, those decisions I made were based on associations that I had, not necessarily what other people had. So it's a little bit more of a kind of benign case, but we can see how the prevalence or preference of different pedagogical styles can end up influencing the way that we design. And then when it comes to giving it to another person, the whole thing kind of falls apart. Getting back into bodies, and I work quite a lot with wearable technology. This is a kind of anti-corset, I say, that I've been working on with Rachel Frere, who's done quite a lot of wearable design for vocalists as well. And so thinking about the kind of constriction and, I don't know, general negativity that we have about bodies and body shapes in sociocultural applications, there's expectations on how people are supposed to look that we have. So when we design musical instruments, it's very easy to constrain wearables into those spaces. So we could make a sensing corset that senses when somebody breathes, and if you take a look at other researchers who've done similar things like Kelsey Cotton, she'll comment about how restrictive and how actually at points it was leaving kind of bruises on her. There's this assumption that the body will fit into a certain kind of space. So what we wanted to do was to actually counter this and have a corset that over-exaggerated the stretch. So we use some shearing sensors across the front and the back, and rather than constricting the body, actually to allow it to move in particular ways. And in fact, actually designing this, every time you put on a piece of clothing, your body will probably have changed ever so slightly. We were constantly updating this thing because my body weight was fluctuating all kinds of ways, especially post-PhD, lots of weight gains and losses in quick succession. So rather than trying to fit myself to this controller, we just constantly updated the controller and tried to reevaluate the sensor placement according to what was going on with my body in that one particular session or months. And what we end up then doing is, rather than working around an assumption of what the controller should be, what kinds of forms it should fit, we rather allow the body to dictate what that form is. And this is kind of the benefit of, I think, working with a costumer, with Rachel in this case, was allowing, again, instead of an assumed normality about what this object would be, having it be adaptive and iterative. And I'll show a tiny example of me kind of singing with it, controlling some modular synthesizer effects with my voice and breathing. Sorry. So a lot of the, I'll skip over this one. A lot of the different qualities of the modular synth. So in that case, it was the filtering. Every time I was breathing, it was controlling the filtering of my collaborator Valentin's pad that he had there. So just to kind of conclude on some questions, again, how can we negotiate between different cultures and their respective value sets? And then how can we acknowledge and, and challenge inherent bias? So understanding our own biases. So just some very, sorry, I don't know why my slides skip around like that. Some very brief tensions. We have pedagogical conceptualizations versus novel interaction methods. We have this clinging to tradition and associations and norms versus the idea that we want to continually reinvent and make new things. And again, how this adheres between cultural ideas and contemporary approaches. So some questions to consider. So where do these assumptions and practices emerge from? We can identify them better. And then how do we actually express different valuations we have? And then for acknowledging and challenging inherent bias, we have artistic query and novel approaches that are available to us, but they are confounded by our social norms and sociocultural expectations. We can employ, for instance, feminist design to try to undermine these power structures, assumptions, labels on things, ideals. And I just encourage everybody, let's talk a bit more about power structures in music and arts tech. It's very easy, I think, to dismiss these things. Oh, we're just, making music tech, but these pervade everything that we do. So how can we confront this and not excuse ourselves from this conversation? So, yes. Thank you very much for that. I'm looking for PhDs, if anybody knows anybody who wants to work on cultured musical instruments. And here are some references in case anyone's interested in those works. Thanks.
Can you bring back one slide?
Oh, yeah, of course.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any questions? I agree that obviously lunch is calling.
Yeah.
But, one of them.
That was really great, thank you.
Thank you.
My name's Brian Condon. It's a really difficult issue, isn't it?
Yes.
There's cultural value. So, for example, my background, I'm half Irish, so there's a lot of Irish singing in my background, which is prized in the community and in my family, but is looked down on a lot in the classical tradition because of the way the voice is used and also the way the instruments are used. So you talked a bit about negotiation. How do you... Say a bit more about how you see that. How do we kind of value our cultural background in music and bring it into contemporary music?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a massive question. And it comes down to how do we do this in general, I think, let alone in music. I think aspects of participatory design can be really, really useful here. So following up on the work that I had done with singers in these other traditions that I myself wasn't very familiar with. So taking time to understand what the priorities and the particular evaluations are is very important. I was working with a Hindustani singer who, her whole conceptualization of pitch and the way that she understood her voice moving is very, very different from my own. And so when we redesigned the mapping with her in mind, I originally had given her one that I had made, didn't work, so we had to do it together. But I had to understand how she was conceptualizing in order to do that in a way that made sense in her framework. I think that's probably, on our level, one of the most base things we can do is not to assume that the way that we think, of course, is the best. And I think especially trying to, come up with a kind of very solutionist mindset. I mean, any mapping that we choose will value certain things. So if you wanted to create a device for Irish classical singing, I would say work with these traditional singers and think about what their priorities or what their interests are, actually get into the sense of, what gives them the most excitement and joy. I think uplifting from that side would be really, really beneficial for us as a community in NIME.
Well, I think, let's take the other questions into lunch, I guess, and let's thank Courtney again.
Thank you.